And also before starting today's session, we wanted to acknowledge that everyone here today is calling in, we assume, from different parts of Turtle Island. I personally am based in unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe land, colonially known as Ottawa. And we encourage everyone on this call today to approach this workshop in the spirit of decolonization with an openness to learning and a commitment to justice, recognizing the importance of basic income activism working across and with other social justice movements. If you know the traditional names of the lands that you're calling in from today, we'd invite you to write that information in the chat and invite everybody on the call today to engage in continuous and ongoing reflection about how the basic income movement can actively work towards decolonization and reconciliation in our advocacy. There are captions that are available during this webinar for accessibility. So if you go to the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a button that says live transcript. And if you click on that, you'll see automatically generated captions. They're not perfect. They're new to Zoom, but they work pretty well. And we'd ask everybody to mute themselves when they're not speaking. It just makes those work a little bit better and make sure that everybody can hear. There'll be a couple different points for questions as well throughout this evening, but if anything comes up in the interim, please feel free to put it in the chat and we'll make sure that we get to it. So yeah, I think without further ado, we'll get us started. And I actually think that we've got a poll to get us started, or 2 polls before we actually kick off the evening, just asking about everyone here today's experience with letters to the editor before. So I'm gonna launch the poll. There's 2 questions and everybody should be able to see it now. Just asking if you've ever had a letter to the editor published before and how knowledgeable you feel right now about letters to the editor, whether it's completely new to you, if you're an expert, just where folks are at before we get started for today. So we'll just give people a couple seconds to pop in their responses there so we can see where folks are at. We've got a couple people who have had letters to the editor published before, quite a few people who this is totally new to them or they know a little bit but not too much. No experts yet, apparently. We'll just give it a couple more seconds if anyone else is trickling in. Great. So there we go. Yeah, okay. I don't know if anyone else could see the responses except me when I was saying that, but there they are. They're visible to everybody now. So yeah, we've got a couple people who have had letters to the editor published before, which is awesome. So that's the goal for the end of the day today, or the end of the evening. This evening is for everybody to have a good sense of what letters to the editor are, how you can kind of add them to your basic income advocacy tool belt, yeah, what you can do after this session to actually start doing this on a maybe even regular basis. So exit that out and on to the next slide. So just the agenda for this evening, we'll be starting off with introductions, and then we'll move forward with actually covering what letters to the editor are. I did not know the difference between letters to the editor and op-eds when we started this session, and Tracy and Katarina had the pleasure of explaining that to me, and why they're so important as something that we can be doing as part of our advocacy. Then we'll go to the how, actually what are some best practices and how we can actually be writing letters to the editor. We then expect to be joined around 7:30 by the managing editor at the Hamilton Spectator to chat a little bit more about letters to the editor from the perspective of someone working for a newspaper. And then we have a couple opportunities to share some examples and get some practice in before we wrap up, and some next steps. So just starting off with introductions, I've been talking a long time and I haven't introduced myself. So I'll start with myself and then I'll turn it over to Tracy and Katarina. We'd encourage everyone here today to introduce yourself in the chat, and who you are and where you're calling in from, and maybe what, if you're involved in the basic income movement, what that role is. But I'll just start with me. My name is Chloe. My pronouns are she, her. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Basic Income Canada Youth Network, which started in 2020. I'm also the youth liaison with the Ontario Basic Income Network. And I'll turn it over to Tracy and Katarina to introduce themselves before we get into the fun stuff for the day.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tracy Smith-Carrier. I'm an associate professor in the School of Social Work at King's University College at Western University, and I'm also the research coordinator at the Ontario Basic Income Network. I conduct research on poverty, social assistance use, housing and homelessness, and basic income as a solution to a lot of those symptoms of poverty. So glad to be with you tonight. Now over to Katarina.
Thanks, Tracy. Yeah, my name's Katarina Lindman, and I'm a retired actuary, and I've just joined the basic income movement in 2020. I'm proud to say I've had a couple of letters to the editor published, so that's been nice. And I really like working with volunteers and helping them kind of achieve personal growth so they can increase their political power. So I'm the internal relations coordinator with Ontario Basic Income Network. I'm happy to be here tonight.
And I think we're passing it right off to you now, Katarina, to share the what and why of LTE. So over to you.
Okay, so we're going to learn what letters to the editor are and why they're important. I think go to the next slide, please. So what is a letter to the editor? Well, we call them LTEs. They're a short letter that is published on the opinion page. So it's not a reported story, it's an opinion, but it lets the editor and other readers know what the readers think. It's a way to continue the conversation that's going on in the newspaper. So what you can do is you can respond to news items and opinions that are already published recently in the news. And I like to think of it as the haiku of activism, because you have to do it very sparsely. There's often like word limits to the letter to the editor. And so you have to say what you want to say very shortly. Next slide, please. And Chloe, were you going to spotlight me so that people can see me? Thanks. Okay, so why write letters to the editor? There are three main reasons. One is because people read letters to the editor, so that's a way to educate and inform other people in your community. And that's really important, because if people learn about basic income and they're informed, they can think about it, you can change minds, and then they can also have conversations with people in their circles. For the media, it's really important because it signals the issues that readers care about. So even if your letter to the editor doesn't get published, you're still sending a signal to your local paper that that's important. And lastly, for politicians, politicians follow closely what letters to the editors are published in the local papers, and then that's a way for them to get a pulse of what voters care about. So those are three important reasons to write letters to the editor, as well as it helps clarify in your own mind. Like when you're writing a letter, you might have to do some research, you think about something, you analyze it, and then that helps you come to more knowledge and more conviction of why basic income is so great. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how to write letters to the editor. So letters to the editor, it's good to actually subscribe to the newspaper in question, and you keep your eye on the news, and you choose something to respond to. You should also refer to your local newspaper's letter to the editor guidelines. So those guidelines will probably tell you like how long, what the maximum word length is. So sometimes it's 200 words, sometimes it's 150, sometimes it's a little longer. The best way to send your letter to the editor, I think for speed, is through electronic mail, through email. Back in the olden days, you'd actually put them you might write them out by hand and send them via the post office. And another thing to do is to check for syndication opportunities. And what that means is, if the article that you're responding to is syndicated, it means that it's printed not only in that newspaper, but in other newspapers. So if it has been published in more than one place, you could send your letter to the editor to more than one place. So I did that recently with the letter to the editor example that we're going to be going through. And that way I was able to submit it to 7 different papers. So for example, Post Media owns a bunch of papers, so often an article will be in more than one paper. Usually if the paper owns a few, if it's a paper chain, if you will, if they own more than one. The next slide, please.
All right.
And I think we're over to Tracy at this point.
Yeah, thank you, Katarina. The choosing what to respond to, I guess, I mean, it doesn't have to be something basic income explicitly, but if we can find a way to kind of bring it back to basic income, then really you can be choosing anything to respond to that you think will provoke a reaction. In terms of things that there is kind of a hierarchy in terms of what columnists or editors might be looking for in terms of letters to the editor. The editorials and front page news, clearly that's where most people are kind of looking when they're looking at the newspaper. So going for a story there is certainly helpful, but you could also respond to staff written columns, locally written op-eds, syndicated columnists. So a syndicated columnist is a columnist who maybe isn't a journalist with that newspaper, but has a reoccurring column. So Jamie Watt, for example, often writes for the Toronto Star. So he's a syndicated columnist. Inside news stories, editorial cartoons, or other letters to the editor. So those are the things that you might be considering in terms of where you might start. And then in terms of the LTE formula, we'd be, of course, Katarina already mentioned, really sticking to the word count. So you really have to make sure before you send that in that you use your word count on your word, for example, and making sure that you actually do fit within the guideline prescribed. We really want to start with something that's going to grab the attention of your readers. And so some sort of a mental hook is a good way to capture people's attention. So either using some sort of a rhetorical question, are we ready for a basic income, for example? Using amazing facts that catch people's attention, just 3% of the budget. That's all it would take as a way to start. Or sound bites, using the word imagine, for example, to capture people's attention. Imagine a world where everyone had enough. Or like I said, those sound bites. Andrew Coyne just wrote a piece, I guess it was last week or the week before, saying basic income debunked, not so fast. So trying to, in a very short, snappy sentence or phrase, trying to capture people's attention. You also might want to actually write what it is you're responding to. So you might want to indicate that this piece that you're writing is in response to a particular op-ed or columnist, and maybe even praise that particular writer if you thought it was written well, for your piece as well, as a way to start. The other thing is to consider using literary or poetic devices. They can certainly add to your piece, and I think really try to again, capture people's attention, but use them sparingly. Don't use them just so you can kind of prove that you know how to use them. Make sure that they make sense. So what do we mean by literary or poetic devices? Does anybody have any ideas? Maybe you can put them in the chat. What do we mean when we mean or when I refer to a literary device or a poetic device? So maybe while you're thinking, I'll give you a few to start. So a metaphor, so using metaphors, using comparisons, using like or as. So her comments were as refreshing as a summer breeze, for example. Or a simile where we don't use like or as, but we're still comparing two things. The editorial stirred up the usual pot of rhetoric. Personification, so we're giving objects human characteristics. The article gave a double punch, for example. Alliteration, where you basically use words that have closely connected words or sounds. So several small scale studies show massive meaningful results. So I'm using the MM and the SS there, or just using a play on words. There's nothing basic about basic income, for example. The other thing that you might want to consider is that you don't want to try and construct a binary or an us-them situation between you and another group of people. So I try to avoid phrases like those people or these people, poor people, drug users, where you're actually creating distance between groups. You want to try and draw everybody in and really sort of draw in our sort of collective well-being here is what we're looking for. So trying not to construct that binary between groups. Again, trying to make it as concise as possible, as short as possible, using those snappy phrases. We're going to try and avoid long rambling sentences. All right, so the next slide, I guess, or am I already there? Things that we want to do, obviously, we're going to be looking at the problem and trying to find the solution in basic income. So we might be trying to find ways of sort of drawing attention to basic income and how it might affect people's mental health or their gender or gender equality or those sorts of things. We sort of talk about the problem. Here's the solution in basic income. And then perhaps we might want to end with some sort of a call to action where we're actually asking politicians to implement a basic income, or we're asking readers to maybe go check out a website or get a resource or that sort of thing. And then we want to close by also being creative in our sort of way to wrap it up. So we might, if we used a rhetorical question, for example, a question where we don't really know what the answer is, but we, it just gets people thinking, those kinds of questions that maybe we have the response as the final sentence, that sort of thing. So trying both creative ways to first really capture people's attention and then to kind of really nicely end off the piece at the end. Timing is really important. So the sooner you're able to respond to this, the story, the better. They really don't want you to sit on it for like a week, because by that time it's old news in the news cycle and it's just not likely to be picked up. So you could have a wonderfully written piece and it's just too late for them to be able to use it. So trying to do within like a day or two of you being like actually seeing that, that paper that you want to respond to or that article you want to respond to, getting to it right away. You might want to mention your member of parliament or another elected official by name, especially if you are sort of drawing in their values and saying, this is what I know my member of parliament, is working towards, and and so if you're able to kind of find ways of drawing those people in to your piece as well, but we want to do so in a way that's always respectful and doesn't demonize others, which I know sometimes can be really tricky if we really have a really strong reaction to a politician and we are just kind of like, our first thought is to, write something that's scathing and is quite damaging, really. So what I try and think about when I'm doing it is to if I am going to be angry about something, to try and make the anger about the thing or the policy and not about the person. So I don't want to attack people. I do want to be kind of taken seriously by the readers. So we don't want to attack people. We do want to stay focused. We want to have a short, again, concise. Also finding ways of being able to use your own voice and your own experience where it's appropriate and where you think it can be helpful. It really can help other people relate to your experiences and again, draw people in. And some people really do are affected by those kinds of, lived experience stories and things like that, what's really going on for people. And so using your own voice and your own experience can be very helpful. And then drawing on any sort of data or research in your work also adds to your credibility. So thinking about that, but I'd use those sparsely. I wouldn't have like sentence after sentence with, statistics or something. You want a kind of a well-balanced couple of paragraphs. All right, so I think that's up for me. So I think it's over to Chloe now.
Yes, it is me. So I'll spend a couple moments chatting a little bit more about. So we have kind of gone through what the basic income, what a letter to the editor is, and some best practices in terms of how you can do it. And here are just some ideas to get you started. And many of you will have lots of other ideas of where you can take this, but some kind of easy ways or kind of clear ways to bring basic income in to your letters to the editor. So one really easy way that I think many people have been mentioning this recently, but you can cite public opinion. So for instance, a recent poll by Angus Reid that shows that about 60% of Canadians support a basic income. So that's one really useful thing that you might be wanting to draw in. Also showing the myriad of different reasons that people might support basic income. And again, this will kind of depend on what you're responding to and sort of what makes sense if you're responding to an article focused on health, if you're responding to something focused on the economy. But we know as basic income advocates that there's lots of different reasons that you can draw from what you're wanting to build and show support for basic income. So whether that's showing that basic income is a destigmatizing policy and a policy grounded in dignity and equity, or something that provides financial support for labor that isn't always financially valued. So mentioning care work or volunteer work or artist or entrepreneurial pursuits. Depending on what you're responding to, you might bring up basic income as a way to reduce bureaucracy and government oversight. Again, depending on what you're responding to, you might talk about it in terms of encouraging entrepreneurship and innovation or increasing people's ability to take risks. Or you might also draw on the cost efficiency argument. So talking about basic income as something that reduced downstream costs on poverty or on poverty of healthcare or criminal justice systems, or reducing the cost of poverty. Another thing that you might likely find yourself doing in letters to the editor, and that basic income advocates find ourselves doing a lot in general, and especially if you see these things kind of perpetuated in the article you're responding to, is you might find yourself debunking some of the common myths around basic income. So something like people will quit working. And we know as advocates that there actually isn't evidence to support this, that people who receive a basic income or basic income type payments like the Canada Child Benefit, for instance, use the money to go back to school or training or to find a different or better job or to focus on health or caregiving pursuits. You might be debunking the myth that we can't afford it, and then you might be able to point to costings like from the Parliamentary Budget Office that show the basic income is affordable, that it's just a matter of priority, and that we also know the basic income is likely to have downstream cost savings, and that putting money into people's pockets often acts as a direct stimulus to local economies. And then another common one, that people need services and not money, and sort of that pitching basic income and services as this dichotomy, and positioning that we actually need both, and that basic income shouldn't be replacing important and robust social services like healthcare and childcare, but that Canada is a rich enough country that we're able to support both, and that we need to be thinking about income systems and services together. And finally, you might also find yourself referencing outcomes from previous pilots or previous experiments, and sort of mentioning what Tracy was saying around bringing in data. We're lucky in Canada to have the Ontario pilot as well as Mincome, the Manitoba pilot back in the 70s as examples to pull from when you want to point to outcomes from previous experiments. But we've also got experiments from around the world to be able to point to outcomes like reduction in crime rates, particularly poverty-related crime, increased educational attainment, so whether that's enrollment, attendance, or graduation rates, improved health outcomes in terms of mental health, decline in doctor visits, hospitalization rates, self-reported stress, and so on, increased level of trust towards individuals and institutions, community level benefits, as well as the knowledge that money from basic income type programs is usually spent on clothes, bills, food, and those types of things. So throwing a lot of things out there right now, but just to say that there's a lot to pull from depending on what you're responding to and sort of how you're positioning your letter to the editor. And we'll share some resources as well after this presentation in terms of other things that you can draw from, but just some ideas in terms of things that you might be considering incorporating when you're writing a letter to the editor about basic income. So I'm going to turn it over now. I believe that we've got Howard on the call, and Howard is a managing editor with the Hamilton Spectator. I'll let him introduce himself a little bit more, but he offered to come today to share some tips and best practices from the perspective of an editor at a newspaper, somebody who has the pleasure of actually reading and selecting, I imagine, letters to the editor. So he's here today to share some best practices, some advice, and I think also to answer any questions from a legitimate expert on letters to the editor. So I'll stop sharing and I'll pin Howard and let him introduce himself and take it away for the next think 20, 25 minutes or so you said you were able to spend with us, Howard. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome. My mic is on, yes? Okay, good. Thank you for asking me to do this. It's been a bit of a long day, so I'm a bit hoarse, so I apologize. Thanks for the great work. As well as being the managing editor at the SPEC, I'm the chair of the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction. So we are big advocates of basic income. And so more power to you, and thank you so much for putting the effort and energy into trying to get this story told and maybe putting to death a lot of the myths and stereotypes that surround it. Well done for that. Thank you. So I'm just going to speak a little bit without the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction hat on, because this is a really great presentation. You got everything covered. I'll just put on my old hack newspaper hat and tell you what it's like from the perspective of the editors who are dealing with letters to the editor. So the first thing that you need to understand, regardless of anything you might hear or experience even, is that letters to the editor at any newspaper I know are valued like gold. They are the original user-generated content, UGC, if you like. I don't think everybody is as passionate about it as I am, but I know many people are. And I know that, our online metrics as well as our print metrics, when we used to do such a thing, always found that letters to the editor were very well received, very well read. And the beautiful thing about them is that they are unique local content that is not easily available in any other place, if available at all. So don't ever underestimate the value of letters. And if the newspaper in your community doesn't get that, then maybe you can, if you feel like you might want to, you could try to educate them. But okay, so at some real on the ground tips about letters. I know that most of this is in your deck, but I'm just going to reinforce some things from my perspective, because I deal with this every single day. Spectator publishes about 10 or 11, 8 to 10 letters a day, 6 days a week. And then every couple of weeks, we have a full page of letters. It's got 20 or 25 letters. And we are blessed to have an endless flow of letters, so much so that I get people who write to us from out of our market, but I never use them because I just have so many letters from our own readers inside our own market, not just Hamilton, Burlington, Niagara, Haldimand, Norfolk, et cetera, et cetera. It's a great resource. So one thing to always keep in mind is that treat that length guideline like it's sacred. It's really, really important. On a day when I have time, if I come across a really good letter and and it's 20 words over our limit happens to be 250, but whatever. If it's 20 words over, I'll think, man, I would love to see this letter in the paper, and I will try to fix it. And I won't try, I will fix it. I'll get it under 250, get it in the paper. But there are many days, especially with current circumstances, both economically for newspapers and in the pandemic, where I don't have time to do that. And I guarantee you most editors out there don't. So anything that's over the word limit automatically goes over here. And if you've got lots of stuff that's within the word limit, well, you're never even going to get to the stuff that's over the word limit. It's difficult, it's challenging. Writing short is tough. I write editorials, I know this, but you just got to make it work, because if you don't, you're almost taking yourself out of the running before you even get started. Here's a really boring meat and potatoes thing. Don't send your letter to the editor on a PDF. The reason for that is because PDFs, depending on which version you're using and stuff, can sometimes import garble. So the newspaper will take that PDF, try to import it into its production system and bring in the garble. And like this could all go under the heading of, don't make the editor's job any tougher, because really, what's the point of that? It doesn't serve your interest or anybody else's. So send your letters as Word docs or as raw text in the body of an email. That's my advice. So that's what we do, and that's what I tell people. I'll use a PDF if I don't have a choice, but if it's going to cause me a problem, well, I'm not going to use that letter, and that's unfortunate, but that's also reality. So you got to have some respect for the situation that the people are working in, especially these days. The other thing to keep in mind about letters is, I don't know how many of you folks, there's a lot of you here, I think 20 or 23 or something, are from diverse communities in terms of all different communities, and how many are from the same, if there's 6 or 7 people from the same community, let's say Ottawa or Toronto or whatever, you want to be careful to make sure that it doesn't look too much like it's a letter to the editor campaign. Editors know that often what happens with something, whether it comes up on social media or whatever, it'll get enough people who want to start a letter writing campaign, and they'll write. Now that's good in a way, but the bad thing about it is that editors are not going to run 8 letters on the same subject for the most part. They're just not. I mean, they don't. There's too many letters competing for space, and if the letters give the impression of being part of an orchestrated campaign, then automatically an editor is likely to go, oh, and sometimes maybe overlook it, but at minimum, it might maybe just take 1 or maybe 2. If I get 10 letters in the same subject and I have a feeling that it's a campaign, which it often is and probably sometimes isn't, I'll maybe run 2, but I won't run them all. Unless, of course, you're really talented and creative and you work with your colleagues and you can make sure that they're dramatically different. I also have been known to run 8 or 9 letters in the same subject, but not if they're the same. There's got to be something different about them. Otherwise, you're asking the editor to not put the reader interest first. Doesn't matter. This is not speaking to the importance of the subject matter at all. It's not to denigrate anything, certainly not basic income, but you need to keep stuff like that in mind. So that was length, format. Try to keep that in mind, what I said about letter writing campaigns. I know. Wherever possible, newspapers put a high premium these days on the word local, not just local content, but local. So wherever possible, I think this is in your research anyway, but just in case, try to localize the subject. Like if you've got some local stats from your local social planning council or wherever you get your local stats around poverty, around housing affordability, around social programs, social assistance, et cetera, try to use that if you can. It's the less generic a letter is. So let me repeat that. The less generic a letter is, the better. So letters that have provincial or national stats in them or national info, that's fine. But if all you have is that, and and I hope I certainly know because I write opinion all the time, that this stuff is out there. It's relatively easily available. So try to take the time to localize your content a little bit, and maybe even anecdotally if you can. The more important the letter is to my Hamilton readers, even though online we get a lot of readership from places outside of Hamilton and Southern Ontario, lots and lots. Frankly, I don't care that much about my readers in Vancouver. My primary responsibility is to my readers in my market, the ones who might buy online subs and the ones who might be involved with local decisions, such as, for example, basic income. So it's really important to try to localize it micro, maybe if you can, and if you can't, get as close as possible to that. I could say more, but I think I've said enough. So if you have some questions, I'd be happy to listen to them rather than try to manufacture more things to say. Those are the main kind of, again, I praise you hugely for the work that you're involved with. I can't do any better than what you folks are already doing on that. I'm just trying to speak as an old wizened newspaper editor. So if I can answer any questions from that respect, or for that matter, for the roundtable perspective, ask away.
This is super helpful, Howard. And yeah, if folks want to even come off mute and ask a question or put it in the chat, even that 10 minutes, I feel like I've been scribbling down notes. So it's super helpful.
Good.
It's like there's a question there.
Just, I'm sorry, I came in late. I had a hard time connecting. Is it any good to counter other editorials that you find suspect, that talk about, studies but never quote the study, never quote the detail or any number or who wrote it or where it came from? just the study, like was mentioned in the editorial we read for preparation?
Sure, and I didn't read that, apologies, but the answer to that question is a very short and sharp yes.
Okay,
It's refuting previous commentary, whether it's a newspaper's editorial, like say one of mine, or a column, or for that matter, a previous letter to the editor. The only thing is if the refutation of the original point takes into account everything that you've just heard and that's in the deck about, address the issue, not the person, et cetera, et cetera. Don't personalize things. What I would say is that a newspaper editor isn't going to be interested in endless refutation or repeating, and the person, newspaper editor probably isn't going to want to do rebuttal to rebuttal to rebuttal to rebuttal. We just don't, we can't really do that. The cycle is too short for that. But a lot of the letters that I run and many of the letters that I think are best consumed by our readers are letters in response to something else, refuting something I disagree with. Sometimes I agree with, but frankly, the ones that disagree are probably, from a readership perspective, are probably typically more interesting. So yes,
okay.
Do keep in mind all the principles about that have already been mentioned. There's no point in responding to something, even if it's an ad hoc, ad hominem kind of a silly thing that some letter writers do, and editors run them sometimes. I'm one of them, not always, but sometimes. Don't respond in the same way. Respond with data, with force, with candor, straightforward, conversational. That's the way you want to do that, and then it's absolutely worthwhile.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You got quite a few questions coming in the chat, Howard. So first, you got Hannah asking if the importance of letters to the editor has changed in the age of social media.
Well, that's really a great question. The answer, and I'm sorry to give this answer, but I'm going to give it anyway because it's true. It's yes and no. It has changed because people will resort to online commenting on Facebook, on Twitter, on social, and on the newspaper itself if it's got commenting available. I used to think that would result in a reduction to the overall in the letters to the editor, and it may from time to time, but I can now say with dead certainty, having done the work I'm doing now for too many years, more years than I care to count, it can happen, but not if the newspaper editor involved really loves and appreciates the values of letters to the editor. I do, and honestly, they're self-perpetuating and they grow themselves. If you really water them and fertilize them and take good care of them, you can get more than ever, and that's what's happening with us. So that's the yes and no answer to that. I hope that doesn't sound too equivocal.
You've got another question from Larry asking about grammar and whether a letter has to have perfect grammar to get published.
Now, that's another great question. And I answer this one from the gut because I used to be, anyway, never mind. I was going to say something that you guys don't care about. I don't want to say yes and no again, but in a way it is, first of all, if the letter has got a really, really great overall thrust, but the grammar isn't perfect, that's one thing. Then a person like me will say, that's person's really got something to say. I'm going to work at making it possible to say it. If it's too far off, then maybe no. And if the workload on people is too much, then I got to admit a letter that's going to, if I can take a letter that's going to take 10 minutes as compared to one that's going to take 30, I will probably sometimes opt for the 10-minute one. So a suggestion in that regard is to get somebody else to look at letters before they're sent, before you hit the send button. Maybe somebody who's, maybe whose grammar is a bit better than yours or not. And it can't hurt. It's too bad when letters get set aside strictly because of grammar. But again, I can't publish letters that have really bad grammar in them. I just can't do that. And so if I don't have time to fix them, then yeah, it can make a difference.
I'm going to just keep feeding you questions from the chat, Howard, until I get interrupted. But Kendall says, my dog just shook in the background, I'm sorry. Kendall says, thank you so much, Howard. This is super helpful. I'm wondering if you could tell us about some qualities of past letters that really stood out to you and moved you beyond the basics, what catches your eye?
Sure. That one's easy. The letters that catch me and move me, as you put it, are ones that are, I feel like somebody's trying to have a conversation with me or with our readers through me. The ones that are not overly academic, but that doesn't mean they have to be downwritten, if you know what I mean. That doesn't mean they have to be, pardon the expression, I don't like it, but dumbed down. But they do need to be accessible. And so sometimes when people are trying to make a point in letters, they use a lot of language that's, might be academic, or that anything that renders a piece of writing less accessible is going to ultimately be less successful, even if, whether it gets published or not. So I would say the stuff that when I read a letter from the dozens and dozens that I look at every single day, the ones that get me are the ones that are part visceral. The visceral is what grabs you, and then you want it to also have something. It can't just be visceral. It can't just be, I'm mad as hell, and it needs to be, I'm mad as hell, and this. But the passion is important. So letters that are passionate in my books, and in my experience with our readers, that's what they like.
Awesome. Hannah is asking if it's common for journalists to peruse letters to the editor for story ideas, and have any that you know have gotten picked up as news stories.
Yes. The short answer to that is yes. I don't know if it happens, journalists at all papers, and for that matter, electronic media too. I mean, they're really busy and snowed under and everything, but I know that many of our journalists, I don't know if all, I'd like to think all, they, if they don't read them every day, they read them. And I often give them a heads up, and I will say, make sure you have a look at the letters tomorrow or today, because it's got stuff you should read in it for whatever reason. And have some of them turned into stories? Absolutely. And often a person writing about something, that is a letter writer, might fold into the news cycle. And often reporters will say, hey, can you send me that person's email address? And most of the time I do, not always, but.
Were there any other questions, either from people who want to ask, or ask out loud, or in the chat? No questions from Peter, but very much thanks. I guess I'll ask you one more question if you have time, Howard. Just and because we've touched on this, I think, a little bit, but I guess if you're wearing both hats for a minute, if you're wearing the Hamilton Roundtable, Poverty Roundtable hat, and your managing editor hat, I guess from like a basic income perspective, is there any advice that you'd have about writing letters to the editor, specifically about basic income? I think there's been so much media, obviously the past couple of years, but even in the past little while. And if there's anything, any advice that you'd give specifically when writing about basic income that folks might find useful?
I don't know, because I don't know how sort of informed. I'm guessing this group is pretty well informed. A couple of small things. I assume that you're aware of the McMaster study that was done on the basic income pilot, which is loaded with great stuff. Now, I know it's not necessarily local if you're not in Hamilton. So how useful it is in Ottawa or Toronto or something, it's a fair question. But it's a great piece of work, and it's so rich. I think the thing that strikes me more than anything about basic income is the extent to which the stereotypes persist, even when the evidence doesn't support the stereotypes. One of the things in your deck talks about, this is a great, oft repeated mantra of many people, including conservative politicians, that, it encourages people to be lazy and stuff. Well, the McMaster study and our own experience with the pilot projects in Lindsay, Brant County, and Hamilton proves that that's not the case. In fact, if anything, there were more people who used the basic income to help them get better jobs and further their education. They didn't stay home. this stereotype about people, this allows me to stay home and sit on my butt and not work. It's just not borne out by any fact. It wasn't even borne out in MinCon. So I guess that's a long, windy answer to say, the more you can do to push back against these things, sometimes I think it's just a matter of saying it again and again and again, and eventually maybe enough civilians slash voters slash citizens might start to change their mind a little bit. And that's what it's going to take to get politicians to change their mind, I suppose. I don't really know. And the other thing about that I would stress, if I was writing letters about basic income as opposed to editorials, is that so much of it is about poverty, but it's not all about poverty. We all know that basic income could be one of the keys to addressing employment fragmentation and perilous employment and precarious employment. And that's the way that the economy is going. So it makes so much sense on so many levels. And the main one is humanity and poverty and a better way to do social assistance, but it's not the only one. And to the extent that we can all reinforce to folks that this isn't an ideological thing, it's not an altruistic thing, it makes perfect sense. All the research is there to show it. And it's not strictly about poverty, but a lot of it has huge impacts on poverty. So I think we just got to keep hammering home that message. I don't know if that's not a great answer, but that's the best I can do.
I think it is a great answer. And I think it's when we think about it in the movement, I think, as you know, a lot as well, sort of how much do you focus on poverty versus other things, especially because different people care about different things, right? I've had a couple questions come in, and feel free to just let us know when you're out on time, Howard. I know you had a limited amount of time, but Sharda is asking how much of a personal story is effective.
There's not a black and white answer for that one, but I would say the more a writer can give an audience a chance to feel them, if you know what I mean, sort of, yeah, this is not just somebody writing about something academically. They have experience. They went through this. That's good. That's very good. It's not necessarily a substitute for everything else. I mean, I still think you need good data and you need good information. But if, for example, you want to put out a personal reflection based on your personal life, your family, your friends, or whatever, perhaps coping with poverty, perhaps coping with precarious employment, absolutely, it's a good thing to put that in there, but I wouldn't necessarily let it dominate entirely. And if you've only got 250 words, it's tough to get everything in, but if you can, yes.
And this might be the last question, but Louise is asking if it's a good idea to write a letter to the editor and copy it to PM and MP, which I think they mean Prime Minister, Member of Parliament, or vice versa. So basically shooting off letters to the editor to the media as well as politicians.
That's a really good question. And I'm going to give you an honest answer that some of you probably won't like. It's no. I get a lot of open letters. That's what I call those things, open letters. They're sent to every media outlet. They're sent to every MP, every MPP, the Prime Minister, probably the mayor, a bunch of other stuff. Though I'm not saying those things don't have value at all. If that's something that you want to do, then absolutely do it. But I prefer, if you're going to do that, then do your open letter to the people you want to do it to, but then craft what you've got into a letter to the editor and send that separately. Again, this is under the heading of don't give the editor's got 3 or 4 times as many letters that he or she can use than they're going to be able to use. So don't give them any excuses. And sometimes when they see an open letter that appears to go to everybody and their dog, again, not to denigrate doing that, there's a good reason for doing it, but it's probably not going to make it as effective a letter pitch as if it's sent as a letter to the editor.
Can I chime in on that question a little bit? I agree with that, and but I would add, if you do get success in publishing, getting your letter to the editor published, it is a good idea to write your MP and say, hey, look I wrote this letter to the editor and I really care about basic income. Have a nice day, and what do you think, or something. That
is so true. That's absolutely true. And I can tell you from my own experience that they might not want to admit it, but the press people in Ottawa and Queen's Park, they read editorials, they read columns, and they read letters. even if they probably don't want to admit it, but trust me, they do.
Yes. Yeah, I've been in to see Bardish and she'll say, yeah, I saw your letter. I go, yay. So.
2 quicker ones in the chat, Howard. Craig asking, they're quoting a tweet in their letter to the editor. Is that okay? And Sharda asking if a call to action is appropriate for a letter to the editor.
You guys have great questions. The answer to the first one about quoting from Twitter, as long as you, or for that matter, Facebook, I suppose, as long as you say that's always credit, always just say, you know, somebody on Twitter said this. Don't have to, that's all you have to say, but you should do that. And the second part of that question was, I'm going to have to ask for
Call to action.
Yes, and the answer to that is a big fat bald yes. There isn't always a call to action. I appreciate that. Sometimes the purpose of a letter or an opinion is to remind us again that, you know, but if there's a call to action, like call your MP, write your MPP, call your mayor, call your city councilor, absolutely put that stuff in for sure.
One other thing that strikes me is we need to call to action the people who this is really going to affect long-term, people, the 20-somethings, 30-somethings. I've been going through, how do we connect? How do we inspire them? Do they read letters to the editor? Should we be going after different columns or different places in placement in the?
Maybe, but you're right. You're absolutely right. People who are 20 today are going to care about basic income in 20 years. If they don't care about it now, you can be absolutely guaranteed. I won't care about it. I'll probably be dead, but they certainly will. And I'll be honest, you know about newspaper readership. It's not the be all and end all, but keep in mind that a lot of newspaper content, until Facebook gets really mad at us and cuts us off like they did in Australia, still does go on Facebook and still does get tweeted, and often shows up on Reddit somewhere. So I think that letters to the editor, they always get really good traffic online for us. So I think that it's a good vehicle. I wouldn't say it's the only one. Maybe I mean, if you've got a really solid Reddit group on this subject in your community, maybe you could write the letter and send your letter to the Reddit group as well, or, you know, to a Facebook group or something like that. I'm not trying to say that newspaper letters to the editor are all that in a bag of chips, but they work pretty well and they're well consumed. And you should also look for other options as well.
Thank you.
I'll chime in on quickly, just as the resident 25-year-old, that's something that we're doing a lot of thinking about. Of course, we're part of the youth network, and Leah is also saying that they're 22 and care about basic income as well. I think I don't necessarily read, and I think a lot of my friends wouldn't necessarily maybe engage with a hard copy newsletter. We do read them online, and my parents read letters to the editor, and my grandparents read letters to the editor, and they say to me, hey, Chloe, we saw this letter in the newspaper today and we thought of you. Or I see it on Twitter, or I see it on Reddit, like Howard said. I think that they trickle their way down anyway. And I actually, different from an LTE, but I had an op-ed published in my local newspaper earlier this year, and kind of leveraging the youth piece worked really well for me, where the entirety of my op-ed was saying that young people need to be heard in the basic income debate, and sort of that was I think the foundation for me of getting it published, was that it was a voice that they weren't necessarily hearing a lot in that conversation. So
that's very good advice.
I think we might be just about wrapped up. I think, Howard, we've used all of your time, but this has been super, super great. I'm glad lots of people had questions, and we can let you go, or you can stick around if you want, but if you want to kind of wrap up your night, this has been really, really helpful, and really grateful to you for taking the time. Yeah, for everyone else, we'll stay on and we'll get some practice before we wrap up for the night.
I will move on if you don't mind, but I just want to thank you all for your interest and engagement on this subject. I don't have to tell you how important it is. And I meant the basic income stuff, but newspapers are important too. So keep trying to get in touch, and all the best to you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you so
Howard.
much.
That was awesome.
That was awesome. And with that, we'll turn it back over. So Katarina's going to share an example of a letter to the editor she had published, and then we're going to go out into breakout groups and start thinking about some of this more practically. So Katarina, over to you.
Okay, I want to share with you an example of a letter to the editor that I got published, and it was published in Prince Edward Island, which I was really happy about. And the article I read wasn't about basic income, the one that triggered my letter. It was actually about carbon pricing and the carbon tax. And as well as being a basic income advocate, I'm a member of Citizens Climate Lobby. So we lobby for carbon fee and dividend, which is basically the policy we have in Canada right now, where we have a steadily rising price on carbon emissions, and then the money gets divided up and sent back to citizens so that poor people don't have to be burdened by the carbon tax. They'll actually get more in rebates than they pay in the taxes. Anyway, that was a long-winded sort of thing about carbon pricing. So when I read this article about carbon pricing, I was actually a little nervous because I thought, oh, is Sylvain Charlebois going to trash the carbon tax? Am I going to need to write a letter to the editor and refute his arguments? What's he going to say? And to my surprise, he was actually kind of favorable to the carbon tax. Like he said, we need it to fight climate change, but he did end the article this way, and he ended it like this. Some consumers will be willing to pay the right price for food to help save the planet, so the effects of a carbon tax won't be much of an issue. But the federal government is clearly not considering how the carbon tax could put many Canadian families in a state of food insecurity by 2030. So when I read that, I'm going, oh my goodness, food insecurity in 2030? Like, we really need to kind of not have people food insecure by 2030. Surely we can get basic income implemented in Canada within the next 10 years. Like, come on. So I was kind of angry, and I wanted to channel that energy. So I channeled it into writing a letter to the editor, and this is the letter I wrote. The author of the op-ed, From Farm to Fork, is concerned that by 2030, even more Canadians will be food insecure. I hope not. I believe in societal evolution. Food insecurity is caused by poverty, and more Canadians than ever are realizing that the best way to eliminate poverty is with a basic income guarantee. The province of Prince Edward Island is negotiating with the federal government to implement a basic income guarantee in the province. I'm confident that the experience in that province will make other Canadians want a basic income guarantee, and that the federal government will deliver this, similar to how we got universal health care after Saskatchewan's success. Wouldn't it be grand if the province that is the home of Confederation, as well as Anne of Green Gables, also enabled Canadians to get a basic income guarantee? So I was hoping with that final sentence, I was painting a picture of the possibilities. I wasn't attacking the author of the op-ed. I was just responding, I think, in a visceral way that, like Howard was saying about, that I really hope we're not dealing with food insecurity 10 years from now, that we can evolve before then. So that's my example.
Awesome, Katarina. So we are going to have, sometimes I actually find that it's helpful. We've seen some examples of maybe what to do when writing, but I often find I learn well when I'm presented with a negative case example. So what we're going to have you do is break out into breakout rooms and review the following. So what's on the slide here, and basically come up with a critique with the members of your group about what are some of the strengths of the piece, and what are some of the issues that you might think might not be clear or should probably be addressed before sending it off to the editor. So we're just going to spend a little bit of time, probably about 5 minutes, Chloe? 5 minutes, good. Okay, yeah. So we'll go into breakout rooms for 5 minutes. And maybe you can just briefly introduce yourself when you're in the group, and then you're going to read through this. You should also have a copy of it. Hopefully you got it in your email as well.
In the chat box as well.
It's in the chat box as well. Oh, perfect.
Okay, great.
Or you can take a picture of your screen if you'd like. That's another way of doing it. And then have a conversation about what are some of the things that you think are helpful in this, or what is, you know, potentially problematic or could be clarified. So let's do that now. I think everybody is back.
Okay.
Everybody's back.
Everybody should be back now.
Okay.
So wondering if you had some thoughts about your critique in terms of what could be done to maybe improve, or were there problems with that letter to the editor? And by the way, this one was written just for the purposes of this presentation, so I'm not taking offense. It wasn't published anywhere.
It should have been.
Okay.
Oh, Tracy, okay, so I'll just reiterate some of that. I would have not given them so much merit. From the BC panel, I would not have given them much merit. In fact, I would have questioned their ability to make this decision public, to actually. Yes, buried in 500 pages of ideological theorizing. I would have used that against them. I would have also quoted from the Cancia report to some degree. Yeah, and a call to action at the end.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
So those are some of the strengths.
Sandra, just quickly, a little aside here. What is that report that you're talking about that you would have quoted from? The Cancia report?
Cancia. It's just
Can
a
you
brand.
just-
It's
can you spell it?
CANCEA, I believe. It's a brand new. It's a huge study that they've done, projecting for the next 25 years how it would be financed, what the spin-off impacts would be. It's massive. It's on the website for basic income.
Okay, thanks.
On the Canadian one.
It's now in the chat. Thanks, Chloe, for adding that. That's great.
So it's like the ICN, did you say?
Cancia.
No.
Yeah,
The
CAN.
Canadian Center for Economic Analysis.
Yeah, which does
Okay.
not take money from big business. And it's quite amazing, and there's quite a bit online about it.
That's helpful. Thanks, Sharda, for sharing that resource. Very helpful.
Terrific.
You know, the other thing I think is that I'm sorry, I feel quite urgent about this. I think that we should be thinking about the next federal election as a target. We'll be 2 years, 3 years into COVID by then. We've already done, our toe is in the water. We've already done a whole bunch with CERB. We've sort of started that ball rolling. And I don't think, I think we should work towards keeping that ball in the air now and use that as a jumping off point to see basic income come into reality.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
There's tremendous momentum right now.
Oh, there is so much momentum right now. So this is so timely to have this conversation. Did anybody notice anything about this letter to the editor that they thought could be addressed? That it needed anything?
Well, we were mentioning in our little group that it's better to address to address it, maybe not locally, but at least as a country or as a province, instead of mentioning the 60 million people that need a basic income, because it's bringing it too far.
Yeah.
It's making the battle too big to fight. So we were discussing possibility of putting instead of saying that they do not seem to understand what poverty actually means, is to instead explain what poverty means and how people who are poor don't deserve it, that there's always a reason behind it, and that it's not giving free money for people not to work. I think that that's mostly, if you're writing to the editor, the people who are against basic income is what it is. They're just afraid of people being lazy. And I think we have to address it when we write a letter to the editor, because that's what is going to get their interest. And that's where we're trying to convince them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yep.
it's a huge myth.
Yep. Absolutely. And debunking those myths, I think, are so important. Absolutely. Some of the things that I had kind of tucked away in there. There is some grammatical issues with the over 60 million people needs a basic income. There's spelling mistake in there. The 60 million people, I think that was Louise that was talking. Absolutely. Where's that number come from? Because we actually only have 37 million in Canada. So localizing the statistic, like what Howard was suggesting, tying that to the locale that you're talking about, I think would be helpful. And then I also try and suggest not using a lot of words that might be jargonish or could be potentially difficult for people to understand. So structural determinants of poverty, not everybody can understand what a structural determinants of poverty are. So trying to find ways of, it sounds really academic, but like Howard was saying, that sometimes that's not always super helpful. So, breaking down, making it language that's accessible, that everybody can understand, could be very helpful. All right, so over to you, Chloe, because I think we're kind of running short on time.
No worries. We've last minute in the chat done some adapting to the last exercise that we had here. So what we were going to do was actually have folks go into breakout rooms and fully write a letter to the editor. This was something recent that came out of the BC report that's being mentioned a couple times. Basically, an article saying that based on the BC report, a basic income won't lift Canadians out of poverty. We didn't actually originally anticipate having Howard come and speak with us, and I think that was really valuable. So I don't feel bad about the fact that we're not going to have time for people to write an entire letter to the editor. But I think what we'll do instead is we will put you back into breakout groups, and instead we'll have you write the first 2 sentences of a letter to the editor. So what are your first 2 sentences that are really going to hook people in? That's really going to make that managing editor like Howard read something and be really excited to publish it. So that's what we're going to do instead. So I'll put that link in the chat again. That was sent out beforehand. And even if you don't get a chance to review the article and go into it in a lot of detail, don't worry about it. Just write a really snappy first 2 sentences, and then we'll come back and share and chat about those. So you're going to go back into, just because it's the easiest thing for me to do, back into the same breakout groups as before, and we'll give you about 5 minutes to do that. So we'll see you back on the other side. Do we want to just go around, and if one person from each group wants to share your juicy 1 or 2 sentence hook?
I think Susan should do ours.
Okay, so the one that we came up with is simply to refute the headline, which Kancia, again, has a report, not the growing, but an analysis of CCB. And while we didn't write the headline, it's like, why not? The CCB raised 300,000 children out of poverty. So that's not true, that headline, and should be refuted.
Straight up.
That's basically all we got.
That's good.
As a headline.
No, I feel like it's good that, I don't know, I feel like it's good that it's using the same language as the headline. If you're saying won't lift out of poverty and you're saying why not, this program did, I think that's great. So Susan, Sharda, and the rest of their group are refuting the headline. Anyone else want to share their first couple sentences?
Well, I can try, but we didn't write them. We were just talking still. So, so basically, we started with saying that a guaranteed income would not alleviate all of the people's needs in terms of social or health services, but it would allow them to get some breathing room. Basically, I'm making it up as I go, but I'm trying to say what we discussed. It will allow them some breathing room to find solutions to their issues and to be able to improve their lives and their financial condition. So that was the first thing. And the second thing was to bring it to people, bring examples that we know that they are dealing with, because it's everybody's situation right now. Everybody actually does know people who are 25, 30, 35 years old and still live with their parents, not because they love it, because they can't afford a home. And it's not because they don't want to work. They do work, but they just cannot afford a home the way things were easier in the 70s than they are now. And they really keep getting worse. And if we are going to stay in the capitalist system, I wouldn't put that in the letter. Actually. But yeah, I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. I'll let the next person speak now.
That was a good start.
That's okay. Thanks, Louise. Anyone else want to share before we wrap up? I won't pressure anybody, and we're just on time, so I'll take the last minute or so to kind of wrap us up.
You and Chloe help and you let.
Oh, we're good. Okay. So we'll share these slides just in terms of next steps. We'll share these slides, including some other resources, both in terms of some kind of one-stop shop for some basic income resources, as well as some handy places to look if you're looking for kind of more tips and tricks about letters to the editor. And then we would love if people feel inspired after leaving this evening to write some letters to the editor. I know I'm definitely feeling like I'm ready to write a little bit more. And then if you're published, please do share them. Katarina's email is there. She is the Internal Relations Coordinator at the Ontario Basic Income Network, and our Basic Income Canada Youth Network email is there as well. If you have one published, please share it with us, and we would love to amplify that. And we've also got there both the contact us page at the OBIN, at the Ontario Basic Income Network, as well as Basic Income Canada Youth Network sign up. You don't have to be a youth to sign up for our newsletter, and we would love if you did. And Sharda is asking in the chat about ways to connect with others on this call. And that, I would say, I would say register for one of the groups that are listed there. Sharda will be my first suggestion. I don't know if Tracy or Katarina have other advice, or your local provincial group. But I think we're also hoping to host maybe another session like this, and I'm actually going to launch. I'm going to launch a poll really quick, just about future workshops if people would be interested in, because this is kind of our test run to see how this went, to see if people might be interested in some other kind of more hands-on activism-y type workshops. So there's just a poll out about if there are any future workshops people might be interested in terms of writing op-eds, advocacy letters like to politicians, meeting with politicians, or if there's any other ideas that you might have. And if you have one, please feel free to just put it in the chat or send us a message so we can make that happen. And that's all I've got in terms of wrap up the next steps. Tracy, Katarina, I don't know if you have anything else before we stop for the evening.
No, thank you so much, Chloe, for all the work you've done with putting this together.
Absolutely. Thank you both. And thanks to everybody for participating tonight. And looking forward to reading your letters.